Kara. I am one of the dietitians here at Ironwood. I'm going to be going over some cancer and nutrition myths and facts. We all probably have heard, things as we've got our diagnosis, and things can be very confusing that we read on the internet, contradicting information, things like that. So we're just going to clear up some of that today. Some of the information we're going to go over is sugar and cancer, soy and cancer, that alkaline diet, vegan and vegetarian diets, as well as including meat in our diet, organic foods, and supplements. So the myth number one we're going to go over, this is probably the most common one I hear from our patients here, and that's that sugar feeds cancer. Most likely you have heard this from someone in your life, a friend, a family member, and I think that gives us a lot of fear about what foods we should be eating after a cancer diagnosis, and then in general as well. So the truth is that glucose does feed all cells in our body. That sugar, it does not choose which one it's going to feed. It's going to feed all. Sugar is the preferred fuel source in our body. Specifically, our brain really does want that sugar to run. And there are certain cells in our body that cannot utilize anything but sugar to grow and to run, specifically red blood cells. So yes, that is a truth that cancer cells do feed on sugar, but no more than any other cell in our body. And we need sugar for that energy in our body. So sugar directly is not going to make that cancer grow anymore. It's not going to make cancer spread any faster. And eliminating all sugar food sources is not going to cure our cancer. What we do know is that high insulin levels and those related growth factors actually may influence the cancer cell growth and increase our risk for other chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Insulin is related to our sugar intake, and we'll be going over a little bit more about the differences between sugar in our foods. Cancer cells do have many insulin receptors like other cells in our body, but they have more than a normal cell, making them respond more to the cells, to sugar and in our body to promote that growth. So they use the sugar at a higher rate than normal cells in our body, which is why we use that sugar during PET scans. So it's not that there's some confusion there. When we have our PET scan, we see that it lights up because of that sugar. It's just because the sugar is metabolized and used up much faster by cancer cells than normal cells in our body. The truth is that all carbohydrates are broken down into sugar in our body. They're all broken down into that glucose and used the same way. By avoiding all carbohydrates and sugar-containing foods, it can lead to that unintentional weight loss, which we're trying to avoid during cancer treatment. It can lead to nutrient deficiencies, fatigue, increased stress for ourselves if we feel like the only thing that we want to eat is a cookie and we're too afraid to do that, and other things, poor appetite things if we're excluding certain foods in our diet. And many of those cancer preventative foods contain carbohydrates and therefore sugar. Things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, soy, and dairy products all contain carbohydrates. All are going to be broken down to sugar in our body. And we need those foods because, number one, they're supplying our vitamins and minerals that support a healthy body and have many cancer preventative aspects to them as well. So eliminating all carbohydrate and all sugar is not really the answer to supporting a healthful diet. But all carbohydrates are not created equal. So there are certainly things that we do want to avoid and limit in terms of sugar and carbohydrates. Certain foods are going to raise those blood sugars more rapidly and then increase that insulin production in our body, which in turn, when we're doing these fast digesting carbohydrates like added sugars, white bread, these sugar sweetened beverages, the overconsumption over time, that's going to increase those insulin levels, decrease that insulin sensitivity, promote weight gain, promote fat gain, increase our risk for diabetes and obesity, which in turn increases our risk for cancer. So it's more of that excessive overconsumption of these unhealthy carbohydrates that can really increase our risk for cancer. Not so much those carbohydrate-rich foods that are healthy and don't affect our blood sugar so much, like we are going to go over on the next slide. But there's that connection between sugar and insulin and cancer, and how this overconsumption can lead to more of an increased cancer risk. So the recommendations really for our sugar and cancer, it is really more of trying to focus on those healthful sources of carbohydrates that really aren't going to drastically affect our blood sugar or those insulin levels. Things like non-starchy vegetables, small portions of starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, and corn, fruits, whole grains over white grain and processed grains, and beans and soy products. Those healthful sources of carbohydrates are going to give us those anti-cancer properties, even though they do digest to sugar in our body. Other recommendations to help slow that insulin response and not promote weight gain or fat gain would be spreading out those carbohydrates throughout the day. So we really don't want to be eating very large portions of carbohydrates in one sitting. That we're just going to increase the insulin, can promote that weight gain as well. So if we're doing small portions throughout the day, that's going to help keep those energy levels nice and steady. If you see in this picture here, it really shows us what we should be setting up our plate like. And if you notice, there's a very small portion of starches there. Really only 1/4 of our plate should come from some type of starch. And those starchy foods are the ones we tend to overeat more often. But by focusing more on those non-starchy vegetables and fruits and lean proteins, will help with that digestion of carbohydrates and reduce our risk for cancer. Another great practice to include in your daily life would be pairing any type of carbohydrate source with a fat and a protein. What that does is slow the digestion. So things like fruits are typically digested a little quicker in our body. So by pairing that with something like a boiled egg, a handful of nuts and seeds, a hummus or peanut butter, that's going to slow the digestion. It's not going to give our body this large insulin spike, going to help keep those energy levels nice and even throughout the day, and really not promote this overproduction of insulin, which would promote that weight gain and potentially cause that cancer cell growth. Oh, I went forward by accident. Went backwards. Okay. The really big recommendation in terms of cancer and sugar is really trying to avoid sugar sweetened beverages. So any type of soda, regular soda, full sugar soda, as well as some other things maybe we don't consider, like the lattes we get at Starbucks, even juice, Gatorade as well. These sugar sweetened beverages really are these empty calories that spike up that blood sugar, increase that insulin, and over time can make us more resistant to that insulin, leading to things like obesity and diabetes. So really the goal is trying to avoid these as best as we can in our diet. and focusing on more healthful liquids like water or unsweetened coffee or tea. And the other big recommendation is limiting those added sugars. So added sugars are going to be foods that are sweetened with sugar or any other type of like things like honey, maple syrup, things like that. These added sugars over time also have been shown to increase our risk for obesity. A lot of our processed and packaged goods have those added sugars without us really realizing sometimes. So the recommendation is for women to eat less than 25 grams of sugar per day, added sugars per day. And for men, it's less than 37 grams of added sugars per day. So that excludes things that are naturally occurring sugars like fruit. A nice thing now is our nutrition labels do show what has added sugar in it. So if you're looking at a product that you maybe think is on the healthier side, you can go to the back, look at that nutrition label. Under carbohydrates, it will say how many carbohydrates, how many sugars, and then how many added sugars. Really, the goal is to keep that as minimum as possible. But you'll be shocked to see that there is a lot of added sugars in foods, and that's what we are trying to reduce. And now we're going to move on to myth number 2, which is that soy causes cancer. I feel, with my breast cancer patients, those are the ones who typically are most scared of soy. We all hear that, especially those estrogen positive breast cancers, that they can't eat soy products anymore. The truth is that soy does contain phytoestrogens or isoflavonols, which is a phytochemical. It's a chemical structure very similar to estrogen, but it is not estrogen. So there's a theory that this chemical can bind to estrogen receptors and increase that estrogen in the body. Soy foods do not contain estrogen or female estrogen like in a human body. They're not the same thing. Currently, there are no studies that have proven phytoestrogens can cause cancer or increase our risk for cancer. And in fact, a lot of studies have shown that whole soy foods decrease our risk for cancer, including breast cancers. So research shows right now that women who regularly eat soy have lower breast cancer risk. Also, breast cancer survivors who consume soy have lower risk of recurrence. And soy consumption in prostate cancer survivors may also have a lower PSA levels. And men who included soy milk during various stages of prostate cancer saw a slower rise in PSA levels. So we can see that this misinformation about soy has hindered people from eating soy products, which actually may be very beneficial to be including in our diet, especially since it's a good source of protein for us. And interesting too, Asian countries where soy is a very common food in their diet actually tend to have lower breast cancer rates and lower cancer rates in general than countries that do not include soy very often in their diet, like the United States and England, things like that. So the current recommendations are to focus really on whole soy foods, things like tofu, edamame, tempeh, miso, and soy milk can certainly be part of a healthful diet. What we do want to avoid is soy or isoflavonol supplements. So that would be like soy protein powders, soy, and those small byproducts of soy are typically in a lot of processed foods, and we want to be avoiding those. Those do tend to have more of those phytoestrogens, more concentrated amounts of them. And there may be some research that indicates that can increase risk for breast cancer for women who have hereditary breast cancers. And we do also recommend avoiding soy sauce, mainly because of the sodium content. Excess sodium is not good for our health. And soybean oil, which again is also in a lot of processed foods, is typically partially hydrogenated, and can promote inflammation in the body. So those are other two soy products we would want to avoid. But certainly including that whole soy products can be a great addition to our body. Again, if you're not comfortable with that soy, there's no need to include it and have stress about that. But know that it is something, if you like it, that is perfectly safe and reasonable to include in the diet. Now we're going to talk about acidic foods causing cancer and the alkaline diet. A lot of people have heard of this, saying that it can also cure cancer. The truth is that we cannot change the pH of our body with the foods we eat. We can't make our body less acidic or more alkaline. There was some studies in the lab that showed that cancer cells cannot live in an alkaline environment, and that is where, and they grow better in an acidic environment, which is where this kind of myth came from. Our body pH is very tightly regulated between 7.35 and 7.45 pH. So that's a very, very small range. If we had any alterations in our pH, it would be very life-threatening and typically indicates a very serious health condition. So if we had these large fluctuations, likely we would be in the hospital. So this is not something that our body allows us to do. We don't change the acidity or the alkalinity of our blood and our body pH. But there is some truth, I would say, behind that alkaline diet. Not in the sense that it's going to change the pH of our body and promote that. But what we know is that a lot of these alkaline foods, these less acidic foods, actually are very healthful and promote a healthful diet. You know, if we're looking at this list, we see that very strong alkaline foods typically include plant-based diet and plant-based foods. And those are foods we certainly want to be including very regularly in our diet. These strong acidic foods, things like alcohol, soda, and sugar, and white bread, these are processed foods that we're trying to eliminate from our diet and eat less often. So we can see how the alkaline diet would actually push us towards eating a more healthful diet. Meat products typically fall into that acid as well. And that is something we also are trying to reduce our intake of, which we'll talk about later. So I can't not recommend an alkaline diet in the sense that it is promoting very healthful foods. But the myth that it's going to change the acidity in our body is just false. And that goes for alkaline water as well. If you enjoy the flavor of alkaline water, there's no problem with drinking that. But drinking it because you think it will change the pH of our body is just a falsehood. That stomach acid is very, very acidic, making any food that goes in there acidic, regardless of the pH of it. And that's going to be neutralized once it goes into our intestines. Myth number 4. So meat and animal products cause cancer. There is a lot of documentaries out there now, I'm sure maybe you've seen them or heard about them, that really promote a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle, and also kind of scare us into thinking that this is the only healthful way of eating, and that's not necessarily true. A lot of those documentaries are kind of trying to push their motive of a vegan and vegetarian diet without really taking into consideration that we can have a healthful omnivore diet as well. So currently there is no research that suggests a vegetarian or vegan diet had better, they've not been shown to reduce cancer risk greater than an omnivore diet. And that also includes that Mediterranean diet, that omnivore diet. It has not been shown to better decrease our risk for cancer in general either. But what we do know about plant-based foods and animal products is that diets that are high in intakes of red meat, beef, pork, and lamb, and then foods processed meats, they are associated with cancer risk. So yes, a vegetarian and vegan diet can be very helpful and be something we can, focus on, but it's not to say it's more helpful than an omnivore diet. Especially if, you are someone who enjoys seafood and chicken and things like that, maybe a vegetarian or a vegan diet would be something that you would have a hard time following. And we don't want to associate guilt if we were to eat foods that typically wouldn't be on that diet. So we know that diets rich in plant-based foods, and that includes small portions of lean meats, have been associated with decreased cancer risk, such as the Mediterranean diet, but no more than vegan or vegetarian diets, and vice versa. So if you want to follow a vegan and vegetarian diet, that is perfectly fine. But if you want to follow an omnivore diet, that's perfectly fine as well, and we can do that in a healthy way. And it's also to say that vegan and vegetarian diets aren't necessarily healthy, can also be unhealthy is what I should say. It's very easy to eat very processed plant-based foods if we're not doing a vegan and vegetarian diet in the right way. So not to say that all vegetarian and vegan diets are healthy as well. Really, the recommendations for cancer and diet is to include more plant-based foods. So we want to be including a variety of vegetables in our diet, making most of our diet vegetables, fruits, and getting those variety of colors we know are going to promote more health, provide us those phytochemicals, which Kendra, our other dietitian, will be going over in 2 weeks. We want to be including those whole grains, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, and whole soy, which all have cancer preventative aspects to them. So that would be the foods that make up a vegetarian diet, but we can also include the protein. I just included the picture of the Mediterranean diet here. Again, we can see that focusing on those plant-based foods are those recommendations, and we can include moderate portions of seafood and poultry. And then if you wanted to go back, I did a talk on this a couple weeks ago, which you can find in our library. The other recommendations in terms of meat is going to be really focusing just on those lean proteins, including things like poultry, fish and seafood. Soy products are going to be a good source of protein, beans and legumes, and we can include some of that non-fat dairy in moderation. In terms of recommendations, we do want to be trying to swap out some of those animal proteins with plant-based proteins a couple times a week. So not always making meat the center of our dish. Really, those vegetables and plant-based foods should be the center of the dish, and meat should be kind of the extra on the side if that's what we're going to do. The big recommendation is really trying to limit the red and processed meats. Red and processed meats have been shown to increase the risk for colorectal cancers. So that would be something to consider if that's a cancer that you've been diagnosed with, trying to reduce that intake the best. But overall health as well. It is recommended to consume less than 18 ounces of red meat per week. And red meat is going to include beef, pork, and lamb. A lot of people forget about the pork, but pork is considered a red meat. And then we really want to be limiting or avoiding processed meats altogether. If anything that we need to change about our animal product intake, it's going to be processed meats. So that's going to include anything that has been preserved, deli meat, sausage, bacon, chorizo, hot dogs, things like that. We really shouldn't have a very big place in our diet for them. Those have been associated with cancer and really are not very healthy for us. Occasionally, if you're at a cookout once a year, a couple times a year, probably okay, but this should be something that's not included on a daily basis or even really a weekly basis in our diet. Now we're going to talk about some organic versus conventional foods. So organic foods are going, organic farming uses manures, compost, and compost to fertilize the soil and promote growth. Organic animal products come from animals that are not given antibiotics or growth hormones. But it is good to know that organic foods are also grown using pesticides, but these pesticides have to be derived from natural substances. So there is this myth that organic foods are healthier and a safer option than conventional foods, which may not always be the case. Conventional foods, conventional farming uses chemical fertilizers to promote growth and sprays pesticides to get rid of pests. Now everything is a chemical, so that might not be the best word, but these are just synthetic, so things that we have created to promote that growth and get rid of pesticides. Conventional farming raises animals using antibiotics, growth hormones, and medications to increase the growth and prevent disease. But it is good to know that poultry in the United States is no longer used with a growth hormone, so that's not something we have to be concerned about, but they can still use some antibiotics in poultry. And conventional farming uses chemical herbicides on weeds to kill them. So there's really the difference between conventional and organic, what that actually means. But it is good to know that some natural pesticides that we're using in organic farming are actually more toxic than those synthetic pesticides that we use in conventional farming. So just because something is considered natural doesn't make it any safer than something that we've created ourselves. So there is a big list of organic substances that organic farmers can use, including things like disinfectant and sanitizers, chloride products, hydrogen peroxide, parasitic acid, and coppers, which is kind of old way of farming to get rid of those pests and weeds and things like that. But they're not necessarily safer for us. And in fact, sometimes these natural pesticides and organic farming have to use more of these pesticides and products to get rid of things that maybe a very small amount of synthetic pesticide would be able to get rid of. So really, in terms of the safeness of organic versus conventional foods, there really has been no studies that show that pesticides in conventional foods are worse than organic foods, because we're able to use much less than in organic foods or organic farming. And it's really about the quantity that we would be consuming, which would increase our risk. And we're talking very, very small percentages that have been shown not to affect our health. Studies have also shown, have not shown a significant difference in the nutritional value of organic foods over conventional foods, meaning organic foods don't have more nutrition in them than a conventionally raised, apple or something like that. There's a lot of factors that play into the nutrient composition of a food, like soil and the time of the year and things like that. But studies haven't shown that difference between the organic or conventional foods. One thing we do want to know is that pesticides are regulated by the EPA, that Environmental Protection Agency. So these farms that are using these pesticides, synthetic pesticides, are required to go through very safe standards and regulation of those pesticides use. And those have all been shown safe for humans and have not been shown to show cancer growth or cause cancer. Now, there really isn't any studies that show the difference between someone who is eating a completely organic diet versus someone who includes conventional foods in their diet. There's no studies that that have been done to know really what the difference is. So right now, what we know is that they seem safe. Both are safe and appropriate to include in our diet. So really the recommendations when it comes to organic versus conventional foods, it's much more important to focus more on the diet quality versus if you're going to buy organic versus conventional foods. So we want to be including vegetables and fruits and whole grains in our diet, regardless if they're organic or conventional. If you feel more comfortable buying organic foods, then that's what you should do. And if your budget allows for that, then that's great. But if organic foods are not part of your budget and you need to buy conventional foods, the benefits of eating a high diet in plant-based foods that maybe are grown conventionally is still better than not eating them at all. So we can do both. You can buy organic if you want, or conventional or mixed, whatever you're comfortable with, but they're both safe for us. And we know that the benefits of a plant-based diet would outweigh any risk of eating something like a conventional grown food. Like I said, buy those organic foods if it makes you more comfortable, or buy conventional foods if it's not on your budget. And don't feel stressed about it. They're both safe. And always a good practice, of course, is just running your fruits and vegetables under warm water. Those would help get off any residue on a diet or on a piece of fruit or vegetable. So running the warm water has been shown to be effective in removing anything. But it is good to know that typically when they're spraying things like pesticides, it's not when the fruit has actually developed, it's before that, to kill weeds and things like that. So typically it's not getting actually on the piece of fruit we would be eating. And now we're going to go into supplements. So, when I start seeing patients, when they're starting their treatment, a lot of questions I get is, what supplements can I take to support our treatment or are going to help fight my cancer? Currently, research shows that supplements do not offer cancer protection. And some trials have actually shown adverse effects when using supplements for cancer. So, for example, very high doses of beta-carotene have been linked with increased lung cancer risk. So sometimes these supplements can actually do harm to us when we think it's doing something positive. A lot of supplements can actually interact with prescription medications. For example, we wouldn't want to be taking St. John wort with a lot of our chemo medications because that would make the effectiveness of those chemotherapy drugs less effective, and we certainly don't want that. Another important thing to remember is that supplements are not regulated in the United States, so there's no guarantee of what is in them. Really, regardless of how much money you spend on them, the more expensive something is, doesn't mean it's a better quality. So that is typically my concern with supplements is supplements can not have what it says in there. It can be contaminated with heavy metals and things like that, which are carcinogenic. And sometimes they are not actually proven to do what they say they are, which would just be a waste of money. And a lot of people spend a lot of money on supplements. So currently there are no specific food or supplement alone that has been shown to reduce cancer risk. Now, it's not to say that you can't include supplements as a support, but eating supplements alone and expecting that to reduce our risk for cancer without changing our dietary habits or lifestyle habits is really not going to do much for us, unfortunately. It would be nice if it would. It would be very easy if one food could cure cancer, but it's really overall patterns that make the bigger impact. The best time for supplemental use is if you are deficient, you're a known deficiency in a vitamin and mineral, like vitamin D or iron. Those have been shown, of course, effective on supplementing to improve that. But those herbal and other kind of supplements are not going to really prevent that cancer without changing our other habits. So the bottom line is the best way to prevent cancer and reduce that risk of recurrence is by really trying to maintain a healthy body weight, really trying to be physically active and eating a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans, those plant-based foods, of course, limiting the consumption of fast foods and processed foods, limiting the consumption of red and processed meats, limiting and avoiding sugar-sweetened beverages and foods that are very high in added sugars, like our cakes and desserts and cookies, things like that, limiting alcohol consumption, and not relying on supplements to promote that health or cure our cancer. They can be supportive, but really shouldn't be the main focus. So really overall, there are some truths to certain myths, but we don't want to be doing things that are increasing our stress or giving us fear towards our foods. Overall, it's just focusing on that healthy habits and a healthy lifestyle, which are going to be the best for us in helping reduce that cancer and reduce that risk of recurrence and supporting ourselves during treatment. If you're looking for more of an evidence-based, information versus just, hitting Google and trying to see what comes up, which can lead to a lot of misinformation, as well as listening to our friends and family, which of course are always trying to do what's best for us and give us great advice, but may not always be right. Here are a few lists for you. So I personally really like the American Institute of Cancer Research. That's AICR.org. They have great recipes. They have a lot of information on lifestyle, hot topics that we kind of just discussed, as well as some other ones. A lot of good nutrition advice on there as well as foods that we know have those cancer fighting properties. So that's a great resource to utilize. We can also use that American Cancer Society, cancer.net. The Cancer Dietitian is a pretty good resource. She has a pretty good blog, a lot of research and evidence-based there on her blog and recipes. Medlineplus.gov has good information, as well as cancer.gov. And then if you are looking more for complementary and integrative information for health, that website, that ncih.nih.gov, is a great resource for evidence-based, complementary, and integrative resources for you. So those are some good ones to look into if you're looking for more of that information. All right, are there any questions?
Kara, thank you for that informative presentation about nutrition. We actually do have questions from our digital audience. The first question is, what about the keto diet?
So the keto diet, there is a lot of research coming out right now in terms of cancer. I don't think there's enough to make recommendations on it right now, except for certain brain cancers, which have been shown to be successful following a ketogenic diet. My big concern when it comes to a ketogenic diet, I don't believe it's appropriate during treatment, mainly because it does promote weight loss, is very limiting to our what we can eat. And during treatment, sometimes we just need to eat what we need to eat to get the nutrition in. So if we're being more restrictive, that's not always a good thing. The other thing too is the ketogenic diet does restrict a lot of those healthful foods, things like whole grains and beans and fruits. We aren't really able to consume very large portions of those. And those foods have been shown to have a lot of cancer fighting properties. And a lot of time restrictive diets are not easy to follow. Most people are able to follow them maybe for a couple months and then end up going back to the normal way they're eating, which maybe we didn't make as good of changes as we needed to. So That's definitely something that we'll be paying attention to because a lot of research is coming out. But right now at this time, I would focus more on that Mediterranean diet until we have more concrete research on the ketogenic diet.
The next question is, isn't it better to avoid sugar or use alternative sweeteners like honey or maple syrup?
So it would be better to replace some of that table sugar, white sugar, with alternatives like honey and maple syrup. The reason for that is it does have a less response on our blood sugar, the honey and maple syrup too, than table sugar. So that is perfectly fine. But in regards to those alternatives, they are still considered an added sugar and are going to affect our blood sugar more than, our fruits and vegetables and whole grains and things like that. So we can use those sparingly in our diet, but shouldn't be just a complete swap out. Still trying to limit that as best as possible.
The next question is, what is the best diet for someone who is managing uncontrolled diabetes and cancer?
So that really go-to diet would be that Mediterranean diet or that plant-based diet. So we're really focusing on those non-starchy vegetables, which aren't going to affect our blood sugar, including those small portions of the starchy vegetables and whole grains, which are going to be a little slower to digest and not affect our blood sugar as much, and including those lean proteins and the animal proteins as well. So that Mediterranean diet kind of is that standard for both cancer and diabetes. So that would be a great one to look into for both of those disease states. It's been shown beneficial for both.
The next question, should I be juicing?
So with juicing, it is a good way to get extra nutrition if you're not, getting a ton of fruits and vegetables in our diet on a normal basis. But we know that eating foods in their whole form is going to be the most beneficial for us. So if we think about juicing, we typically, like if you think about a cup of orange juice, to say, if you were to juice a cup of orange juice, you'd get you'd use 6 oranges, I think, to get a whole cup of orange juice, probably more than that. And that's not something we would typically sit down and eat in a whole setting. So you're going to get more benefit from eating that whole fruit, getting that fiber, getting those phytochemicals right there than you would from a cup of juice. Not to say it's not a bad thing to include on occasion and something we can include in our diet, but that shouldn't be the main way we get our fruits and vegetables in our diet.
Do you have any suggestions for cholesterol-lowering foods?
So cholesterol-lowering foods are going to be any type of food that's high in fiber. We know those plant-based foods, whole grains, beans, fruits, nuts and seeds, what fiber does in the body is it binds that extra cholesterol and secretes it. So really focusing on that high fiber diet is going to be the most beneficial for that cholesterol.
And what about the paleo diet?
So kind of on similar lines of the ketogenic diet, typically is a little bit higher in fat. The Paleolithic diet, it does promote, healthful foods like fruits and vegetables, but it does exclude other foods that we know are beneficial, like beans and legumes and whole grains. So, I think that it's probably a little bit healthier than a ketogenic diet because we're not as restrictive. But if you're someone who enjoys having things like beans on occasion or whole grains, then maybe that wouldn't be an appropriate diet for you, because again, we don't want to be restricting ourselves of foods that we enjoy because we just have a tendency to overeat them in the future. There's not a ton of science to support a Paleolithic diet, but I don't think it's a bad option, I would say, because you are getting a fair amount of variety in the diet if you were to follow that diet.
And our final question, how about avoiding gluten, dairy, and sugar because they are inflammatory?
So there's kind of a misconception about these types of foods. So gluten is not inflammatory. Actually, whole grains are anti-inflammatory. So unless you have celiac disease, which is that that allergy to gluten, it's not necessary to follow a gluten-free diet. Same thing, dairy is not inflammatory either. So that can be a good source of protein for you if that's something you enjoy in your diet and can give you some of those vitamins and minerals. And I think the other one mentioned was soy, and soy also has anti-inflammatory properties as well. Did I miss one of the other foods? Was it soy, dairy, and wheat, and gluten?
And sugar.
Oh, and sugar.
Yes.
So with the sugar too, that's what we talked about. We are trying to avoid those added sugars in our diet, and that is more of a healthful diet. So like we said, less than 25 grams a day for women, less than 37 grams a day for men. So that recommendation for those sugars is true. But remembering there is a difference between added sugars and naturally occurring sugars that we find in fruits and vegetables and whole grains, which are anti-inflammatory. If we're thinking about other anti-inflammatory foods to include in the diet, those are going to be those healthy fats like fatty fish, nuts and seeds, those omega-3 rich foods like avocado and flaxseed and chia seeds. So including those in the diet as well are going to give you those anti-inflammatory properties. But gluten itself, dairy, are not going to promote inflammation in the body.
Thank you, Kara, and thank you to our digital audience for joining us today for our live Lunch and Learn Nutrition series featuring Ironwood registered dietitian Kara Biber. We hope you enjoyed this session. There will be a replay of this Lunch and Learn on the Ironwood YouTube and social media channels. For more information regarding our supported care services classes and events, please email us at wellness@ironwoodcrc.com. Thank you for spending time with us today.